For the last couple of days, I was debating about whether to put a video out talking about this, but then because everybody else is talking about it, so I might as well. The last couple of days, it's been the Roe vs. Wade, is what everybody's given their take on. Republicans are trying to overturn Roe vs. Wade, and if it gets passed, um, no, if they overturn it, that means so if they overturn the Roe vs. Wade, it will be illegal for a woman to have an abortion, and they're going to come to regret this decision. Now, I mean, the Republicans will regret overturning it because they fail to realize that some women have to have abortions due to medical reasons. Since the era of Ronald Reagan, the GOP has cynically fanned the flames of anti-choice extremism without paying a large political price for the deep unpopularity of that position. Now, these days are far from over, with the Trump-packed Supreme Court supermajority on the cusp of overturning Roe v. Wade, and with it, a fundamental right that most Americans support. The highest price for this unprecedented nullification of civil rights will, of course, be paid by the millions of Americans who stand to lose their reproductive anatomy, meaning the women, basically. But the political price to be paid by the GOP for engineering such a hugely unpopular judicial action in the service of the party's culturally conservative base could also be extraordinarily high. Back in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running for office, he basically enticed the then nascent religious right to join his political coalition by becoming the first presidential candidate to become a full-throated advocate for overruling Roe. Reagan was not an obvious choice to serve as the hero to culturally conservative Catholics and evangelicals. This was particularly so given that his opponent, Jimmy Carter, was probably the first avowedly evangelical president. Reagan, at the time, basically Reagan was a divorced former Hollywood actor, and he was basically governor of California, and at the time he was governor, he had signed a bill liberalizing the state's abortion law, and he was largely associated with the near libertarian politics of Senator Barry Goldwater. But during the 1980s, Reagan advocated for a constitutional amendment outlawing abortion, and that move cemented the rock-solid alliance between the GOP and newly political engaged right-wing Christians. Well, technically, if you're a Republican, you can't be a Christian. They don't align. Many of whom came to be labeled Reagan Democrats because Reagan's cultural positions enticed them to switch parties. From the outset of this alliance, however, the GOP had a fundamental problem. The anti-choice position was essential to attracting the Christian conservatives to the Republican Party. It was not a popular move among most voters, but instead, over the succeeding decades, the GOP became ever more associated with anti-choice extremism. A majority of Americans have consistently remained pro-life, with about 59% of adults believing that abortion should be legal in a majority of cases. In fact, they've come to take reproductive rights for granted. Many observers, including Senator Barry Goldwater back in 1992, or I think that's who they're talking about there, have long recognized the Republican Party was putting itself in a precarious position by standing in opposition to a majority of voters on a critical issue. Now, the fact that the GOP's opposition to reproductive rights is critical to retaining its base, with it being at odds with the views of the majority of voters, they have always posed a potential political landmine for that particular party. It, however, is one that Republicans have managed to avoid setting off due to a combination of cynicism on the part of politicians and the savviness of allies in the Supreme Court. Now, Reagan and George H.W. Bush had together named 5 justices to the court by the year of 1992, and that year it appeared that the Supreme Court was poised to achieve the long-stated GOP goal of overruling Roe and paving the way for the recriminalization of abortion when it ruled on a case challenging abortion restrictions that was signed into law by Pennsylvania's anti-abortion Democratic Governor Robert Casey. The nation was surprised when the 3 justices nominated by GOP presidents, David Souter, Anthony Kennedy, and Sandra Day O'Connor, signed an opinion upholding abortion rights in the Casey case. The opinion was grounded on the principle of stare decisis, which is a pseudo-Latin legal term meaning respect for existing judicial precedent. The three justices reasoned that voiding Roe would be profoundly unfair to women who had come to rely on the rule's continued application. They also stated that overruling a watershed decision, which the court staked its authority in the first instance, and they could appear to be a surrender to political pressure, thereby placing the Supreme Court's own legitimacy at risk. Accordingly, they settled to watering down Roe by announcing a new standard for reviving abortion restriction laws called the undue burden test. Now, the Supreme Court Justice O'Connor, who had basically served as a state legislator and was particularly attuned to the political implications of the court's decisions, was likely the prime mover behind the Casey's Compromise, which had the brilliant effect of protecting GOP politicians from the potentially catastrophic political consequences of their own anti-choice extremism. Declaring that overruling Roe was not on the table, the court signaled to GOP politicians that they could continue to demand the end of any reproductive rights, and to demonize the Supreme Court for failing to do so. While remaining secure in the certainty that Roe would remain in place, this allowed the GOP to win anti-abortion rights voters without facing wrath of the majority of America. Now, with the state of affairs, however, it was never a stable one. As GOP politicians continued to rail and campaign against the Supreme Court, the party's right-wing base increasingly insisted on populating the court with true believing jurors who would be relied upon to avoid Roe. George W. Bush appointed two reliably right-wing jurists to the Supreme Court, which included Samuel Alito, who authored the recently leaked draft decision that would overturn Roe. But the court's turning point was when Trump was squatting in Wales. Like Reagan, Trump was a divorcee and a Republican, and thus an unlikely champion of the right-wing Christian activism. Trump managed to clinch the GOP nomination in 2016, in part by promising to appoint only the most devoted opponents of abortion rights to the court, and he definitely fulfilled that fucking promise. Most notably among them was Amy Coney Barrett. As a right-wing legal scholar, Barrett made a name for herself deriding the Casey decision. She argued that the court should not give effect to the principle of the stare decisis in constitutional cases, stating that she tended to agree with those who say that the justice's duty is to the Constitution, and not precedent, reasoning that it is more legitimate for a justice to enforce her best understanding of the Constitution, rather than a precedent that she thinks clearly is in conflict with it. The court, now with the six justice right-wing majority, this year alone chose to hear arguments on the question of whether Roe should be overruled, and it was unsurprising that most of the court's current GOP nominees appeared utterly uninterested in preserving the status quo, regardless of the political consequences that they would face. Nonetheless, the extreme rhetoric of Alito's draft opinion, such as describing Roe as egregiously wrong from the start and suggesting it was heedless of the Constitution, was somewhat fucking shocking. But furthermore, Alito makes clear that he intends the court's voiding of Roe to be a first step in the judicial gutting of other fundamental rights, many of which are likewise increasingly popular, including any rights that pertain to the LGBTQ citizens. But put otherwise, the religious right extremists that Ronald Reagan cynically pandered to 42 years ago are now in full control of the Supreme Court. These citizens, who are about to be stripped of their fundamental rights, particularly the pregnant women without financial means, will suffer the gravest and most immediate harm from the GOP-facilitated capture of the Supreme Court by fringe extremists. The Republican Party itself stands to finally stand to pay a huge political price for the cynical double game that it has played for many decades. The GOP has definitely associated itself with the project of avoiding the right to choose, and indeed, in anticipation of the upcoming court decision, a number of Republican-controlled states had passed currently unconstitutional abortion restriction laws, and once those laws become effective, the GOP will finally have to confront the fact that its position in favor of avoiding a long-term established and fundamental right of personal anatomy places the party directly at odds with the majority of Americans, including citizens whose votes the party needs to prevail in upcoming elections. The consequences of the explosion of this long dormant political landmine are difficult to predict, but it could very well blow up in the Republicans' faces. If you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, your donation to the channel can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.